Hi everyone. In this podcast we're going to take a look at the lab that you had concluded today, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you should have seen happen. To start with, in lab number 1, you were asked to grab a beaker and to fill it to the appropriate amount of water and to put it on top of the hot plate and turn the hot plate up to number 10 and wait for it to start to boil. And so in this first picture here, we basically have a glass or a beaker that is on there and it is waiting to boil. In the bottom one down here, you can see that there is a lot of bubbles that are occurring, and if you were able to see closer, you would have seen that there were bubbles also occurring down towards the bottom. This one was boiling, and once it started to boil, the directions of the lab asked you to put your hand not on top of the beaker but close to the beaker. And if you did that, you would have discovered that it was hot. And so what we would say is that there is radiation that is being given off from this beaker. And so to start with, lab number 1 showed us radiation. And that's an important type of transfer of heat, which you, if you have not already watched the video notes, will better understand what radiation is, but this one hopefully will help you to see it as to what should have happened. In lab number 2, now that the beakers were boiling, you were asked to take and to put a drop of dye, red dye, into the beaker. And as you did this, you can see that the drop is first hitting, and what you would have seen is that it would have went down towards the bottom and quickly rose back up to the top in kind of a circular motion. And this is important because of the fact that it was able to spread the dye very quickly in the beaker. And as we will discover in our class, that convection is the name of this type of transfer. It is important to get the heat that comes from the sun down to the ground, and back up it rises, and it keeps circulating, which keeps our earth at a comfortable temperature. And in fact, these are given a fancy term called convection currents. And convection currents are basically the rising of warm air. It cools and it falls back down. And we were seeing something very similar. This dye, as it enters into the beaker, is cooler, and so it started to sink, and as it warmed up and its particles started moving faster, it quickly rose back up to the surface. And that's why over here that it didn't take very long before the entire beaker was completely red. So lab number 2 showed you convection or convection currents. In lab number 3, you took a new beaker and you filled it back to the appropriate amount, and this time you put 5 to 6 ice cubes into it, and you let it sit for about 10 minutes. And while you were waiting for the ice and the water to work together, you were working on answering some of your lab questions. But when it came time to look at this and put a drop of dye, which this group had done, into the beaker, you saw that it went very, very slowly towards the bottom, and it stayed very close together. And what we discovered is that the particles are moving very slow in cold water versus warm water. And so this was a really good way for us to see something that is called conduction. Conduction is the transfer of energy directly from one object to another. And because of the fact that this beaker was cooled down, it cooled the water. And because of the fact that the water was cool, this dye stayed close together. And so if we wanted to get the dye to mix, all we'd have to do is warm up this beaker. And we could do that by putting it onto a hot plate and setting the temperature to a warmer amount. Eventually what would happen is that the energy would transfer from the hot plate to the glass and from the glass to the water. And again, that would be another form of conduction. But because of the fact that all we did was put ice in here, we cooled the water, we changed the temperature of it, that is a form of conduction. So it's the transfer of energy through the direct contact. And so conduction was shown in a lot of these labs. In fact, we could go all the way back to the first one and say that conduction was shown here because the hot plate gave its energy to the glass and the glass gave its energy to the water, and that would be a form of conduction. Or we could look at the next one and say, all right, again, hot plate giving heat to the glass beaker to the water, and so that's another form of conduction. So conduction is a very, very common type of heat transfer. All right, then what you were asked to do was to answer a few questions. The first one said, explain the process by which the water is heated. So the water is heated, obviously, to start with. It is heated by something that is called a hot plate. And that hot plate was a form of conduction. Okay, so the first answer should have been a hot plate and explain the process. The process was known as conduction. Question number 2 says, describe the motion of the water in both Lab 2 and Lab 3. So if you remember from Lab number 2, we should have seen that there was a circular motion that occurred, and same thing up here. It went very, very fast as soon as we added the dye. So describe the motion of the water. So Lab number 2 had a circular motion to it. Okay, and Lab number 3, that one was where we had the ice, and basically the motion of it was kind of in a straight line coming down, and so it we could say that it went down, went slowly down to the bottom. In fact, you could say something about it mixed together. And for this one, you could say that it did not mix together. So again, we saw all 3 forms of heat transfers in this lab, and hopefully the combination of the lab and your video notes will help you to better understand it. When you are done watching both of the videos, make sure that you fill out the Google form and hit submit, and then we can talk about all of the questions that you have tomorrow. All right, thanks a lot.